So today we're going to talk about simulation. Now we're roughly following the schedule of the course. There have been some adjustments as I tune the content. So today's presentation takes away, in your syllabus it did say we would talk about some railway simulation dispatch software. I've removed that and brought forward topic of queuing from the end of the semester to today, and just the logistics of it worked out better for me to do that. So today we're going to talk about the theoretical concepts behind simulation, and then I'll show you some interesting models that I've made in simulation software for railway topics. So we have a three-part to our lecture today. We have queuing, and then we have a simulation discussion, and then we have demonstration of some of the software models that I've made in the past and done for some research. What have we done so far? We've done Little's Law. We've looked at measures of capacity. We've looked at approximations for capacity. We've looked at optimization. We talked about simulation in a very vague sense, but today we're really going to talk about it in terms of what does it really mean to simulate something and how does that work technologically. So today we're going to start out with queuing. I'm going to talk about the structure of queues. We'll take our coffee break. We'll do a discrete simulation discussion and exercise, coffee break, and then I'll demonstrate some models actually in Rockwell Arena, which I have queued up on my machine here. So let's talk about a queuing system. Oop, that chalk is no good anymore. There we go. So queuing theory. Now the word queue is a little more familiar to you all because you've trained on British English. Very often on the other side of the Atlantic I have to stop and explain what the word queue means on the American side, because on the American side we don't use the word queue, we use the word waiting line or a line, wait in line for something. But of course you all are maybe more familiar with hearing the word queue used in daily speech, queuing up for the bus, queuing up for the cash register. So we want to talk about a queuing system, and here we have a basic diagram of a queuing system and learn some of this vocabulary for a queue. So the system here is everything in between these boundary lines right here. And so we talk about things arriving to the system, and things exiting from the system. And we're generally interested in how the system performs. How does the system perform? So we have to learn a couple of things. We have to learn about the characteristic behavior of the arrival population, the population that we're drawing from. Typical characteristics we're worried about are how big this population is, how it behaves in its arrival pattern, the statistical distribution. And this becomes critical in things like, for example, if we're doing a queue that models the behavior of breakdowns in a truck fleet or in a vehicle fleet. That has a limited population, and that has very distinct effects on how this mathematically behaves. We're going to start with the most basic of the basic in queuing models today. And in those basic queuing models, there is a theoretical assumption that this population is infinite, that we are drawing from an infinite population. Then we're going to look at the parts of the system here. We have the service. We call something the activity that's going on in the queue is the service. And then we have things waiting in line to get the service, the things queuing up, cars, people, customers, whatever. And in here we're very often interested in things like, is there a limit on this queue size? Where would there be a limit on the queue size? Why would there be a limit on the queue? Why would there be a limit in our queue? What real world situation? Morton?
If there's a physical boundary, like the car wash, if there are so many cars around the car wash, you don't just stop at the road.
Yeah, absolutely. You get a physical space in the ground. If we're talking about something with vehicles, is there enough room for the vehicles to line up? What's another example of something where there's a hard limit on the size of the queue? Yeah?
People are not willing to wait more than a certain time.
Now that's another concept. That is I'm drawing a blank here. Yes, Naba. The capacity, but there is that's called reneging. I was stretching my brain for the name reneging. So people get in line and then they sick and tired of waiting and they renege. They get out of the line and they leave. Now, that's not necessarily a capacity issue, but one of the ideas I want to throw at you, now we don't see this as often anymore because the way we communicate has changed so much, but very often telephone switchboards have a limited number of lines, limited number of communication lines coming in. And so very often in the old days there was a problem where you would call some really busy operator center and the first few people would get a line in and be on hold waiting for an operator to answer their call. But then once all those lines were filled up, the next caller to try to call the operator would get a busy signal. And it'd just be busy, you just couldn't get in at all. And that is a capacity limit. That's a limit to the size of the queue. They actually not having enough slots in the telephone center for all the calls that want to come in and get stacked up waiting for an operator. So there's a capacity limit right there. Other aspects of this, certainly the length, the space, the volume to store, the size of the queue that you're trying to do. But the telephone is the most classic example of this, the telephone, queuing up the telephone. In a railway sense, possibly, I was just actually looking at a presentation this morning from someone who's studying freight car yards, switching yards, hump yards. And so in that case, the yard that receives the train before the hump, where they uncouple the cars and re-switch them into different outbound trains, that receiving yard has a fixed limit. So there's a limit to the size of the queue right there in that hump yard at the entry to the yard. And then the queue discipline. Queue discipline means in what sequence are we going to take members of the queue and give them service? In what sequence we're going to give them service? We have a lot of different formats. The one you're most familiar with and the one that we're going to use in these really basic models that we're going to study here for just demonstration purposes. First come, first serve. You're all familiar with that. You know, it's all great. First come, first serve. But some of the ones that you may not have known the definitions for that are relevant in queuing. Anybody know what that one is? Shortest processing time. Shortest processing time. So in that queue system, we would organize the members of the queue according to which one takes the least amount of time to get done, and we'd do that one first. We would sort the queue by the shortest processing time. Many of you probably do this in your own lives without even thinking about it a great deal. You have multiple tasks to do. You maybe go home and you have things to do. You have homework to do. And what do you do first? You do the one that takes the shortest amount of time first because it clears your desk off faster. There are a lot of business environments. In fact, actually, it is a well-known fact that this queuing methodology for manufacturing and for service enterprises minimizes the flow time. Shortest processing time is almost impossible to beat when you're trying to... Yeah, Sean.
Is triage also considered to be a method?
Yes, it is. So triage. So triage, what does that mean? Sorry? Yeah, go ahead.
So triage is when you divide the people who need service or most commonly medical attention into 3 categories.
Yeah.
Doesn't need attention, needs urgent attention, or
Yeah.
can wait.
Now, is that a French word? So I don't know what it means literally in French. Tri means 3. So what does the age mean?
It means dispatching.
3-way dispatching?
No, just dispatching.
Sorry?
It's not related to the number.
Oh, it's not related to number 3. All right, so that shows how little I know about French. But triage, yes, is a queue discipline. And it doesn't follow a very easily measured thing. I suppose if you had a way to put a number on how sick someone was, then you could say you were sorting the list according to the mathematical number of the greatest sickness, the highest value of sickness. But certainly, an emergency room is an example of not first come, first serve. So you go to the emergency room at a hospital, you have some injury, you don't get served in the order you arrived at the hospital. They look at you and they say, oh, you got a bullet in your head, we got to put you in first. And, you know, something like that, you know, Naba.
What about the network of connection? Does it affect
The queue?
It does. It does. So this is a single stage queue. This is a very basic single stage process here. We have a queue, and we have one stage, we're done. And I won't even get into it today. I won't even get into the difficulties that you just suggested, where we could have a series of queues and a series of workstations feeding in a network. That's a whole nother advanced topic. We're not even going to touch it today. But I can tell you it is a relevant area of study. And the way in which you sequence, I already know this for a fact in my research, the way you sequence stages of work in a queue does affect how the system performs. It does have an influence. It has a very big influence. And it's something that actually, in my opinion, is not researched well enough. It is not researched well enough. So queue disciplines. So shortest processing time, first come, first serve. Last come, first serve. Why would I do that? Last come, first serve.
Like an elevator.
An elevator.
Yeah. The last ones to go in are the first ones to go out. Well, what is that?
You think?
What is that?
It's logistics LIFO would be.
Sorry?
What she says is would be logistics LIFO, last in, first out.
Logistics lethal?
LIFO.
Oh, LIFO, yeah.
LIFO.
Yeah, LIFO. And that's another name for, in accounting, you could call it LIFO. Yeah. In accounting, if you're entering, a lot of times for stock transactions or for tax purposes, you would say, I bought a stock, and then when you sell this, and you have a pool of the same stock but with different purchase dates for the shares, you would say, I bought a chunk of shares of stock, and then when you sell them again for tax purposes, you could choose to use an accounting method that says the cost basis will be the most recent purchase block of shares. And so that actually would be an accounting method, LIFO, actually a way of, and it's the same thing. These two are the same thing. You know, last in, first out, last come, first served, whatever. From a transportation point of view, you have a stub terminal. You have a stub terminal, and you're pushing trains or rolling stock into the stub terminal. So which cars do you pull out of the stub terminal first? The last ones that arrived. The last ones that arrived. So any kind of a stub terminal, it's going to be LIFO, or last come, first serve. So that could have weird effects on things like it could mess up your maintenance schedule. You know, what if you have a couple of coaches that end up at the very end of the stub terminal, and because of the way the traffic moves, they never get pulled? They just sit. They never get pulled because you're not rotating the stock. You're always only pulling the most recent coaches out. And so you get some coaches at the head of the track that suddenly go 2 months without a brake inspection because they never get pulled. The traffic they only get pulled at Christmas or something like that. Computer memory is LIFO, or last come, first serve. Computer memory is a stack. You stack the memory in the stack, and memory goes in, and the first memory that goes out is whatever's at the top of the stack. So lots of things, queuing theory in there. So anyway, different queuing disciplines can affect how you do systems, and we are going to stick with this one today for the most basic conversation about queuing theory. We're not even going to touch these other disciplines, but you should be aware that they exist. And they create extra complications in how you're going to do the math and do the calculations. And then we have our service. And so we're interested in the statistical distribution of how the service times process. We're interested in how that behaves. And so I'm talking about distributions of service, and let me kind of segue into a little conversation here. Very basic flow diagram of how we might look at a queue. We have the queue here, frequently notated like this on a lot of simulation programs. The service going on here. Queues are all about variance. They're all about random deviation. If things arrived in a nice, even lockstep with no variation in their inter-arrival times, and then they were always serviced in a nice, even lockstep pattern, and there was no variation, there wouldn't be a queue. There wouldn't be a queue. We have queues because, in fact, these things don't happen with perfect regularity. We have queues because there is, in fact, variation and random variance. in these arrival patterns, and there is random variance in the service pattern. And that variance is what makes the queue happen. So really, queues are all about managing variance, responding to variance, estimating the impact of variance in the operating system, and planning for it. Planning for it, planning for the variance in terms of, well, I know there's variance, I need a line this long to handle the variance. I need this much resources to manage the overflow, to manage the variance in demand. Yes, how about?
Is this what you call then above a continuous service and then a discrete?
So continuous versus discrete. So we could have a terminating, to jump ahead in some of the vocabulary here, we could have a terminating simulation. Terminating. Or we can have a steady state, continuous. The basic queuing formulas we're going to look at in the next slide here presume that these are steady state systems that run continuously. Again, so we're already at the most basic entry level discussion of queuing, the most beginning level of queuing. What have we made our assumptions so far? First come, first serve, infinite population, steady state, continuous, infinite queue, no shutdown, no closure, no terminating condition in this queue. So already we've made a lot of relaxations. We have a lot of limits here that maybe don't apply to the real world. We can try to approximate the real world with these, but a lot of these conditions that we've said that we could all be different here will call out the need for step 2 of our lesson today, which is numerical simulation, numerical processes and numerical simulation software. So we're all about variance here, and we're going to see that really clearly here in the next couple of steps. So let me jump forward. Let's go to the next slide here. So we have a sheet of queuing formulas that I've handed out to you, and I'm going to walk through those with you now. Let's walk through those queuing formulas. First, we want to learn, some of this may be a review for some of you. How many of you have had queuing theory before? Quite a few, about a third. That's wonderful. That's great. So this will be a little bit of review. For those of you who have not had queuing theory, this is a nice basic foundation. We want to get a nice basic introductory lesson here. So let's talk about the notation of queuing theory first. You'll notice the formulas on the sheet that I've handed out to you today have this little bit of a labeling at the top. And we want to learn what that labeling means. So here's the notation. Standard queuing notation looks like this. And sometimes if you're really technical, it goes to 4 slots. I'm not going to bother with the 4 slots today. You can have a 4th slot if you're really into this deeply technically. But the 3 is the basic minimum. The 3 slots here are the basic minimum. So we have 3 slots in this queuing notation. The first slot here describes the arrival process. The first slot describes the arrival process. All of the formulas I've given you have the letter M in that first slot. That letter M means, in this discussion, it means a Poisson process. What is a Poisson process? What is a Poisson process? Yes?
That's correlated element that arrive with the distribution, but the arrival time of one does not depend on the arrival time.
That's true. So a Poisson process is kind of interesting because it quote, is a memoryless distribution, which is still hard for me to wrap my head around. I mean, I proved it as part of my studies when I was studying my probability years ago, but it's still hard for me to grasp, even in my own thinking, this idea that you have a process where what happens right now has no relationship whatsoever to what happened previously. But it is true. It has no memory. It has no memory in the process. What else about a Poisson process? What is a Poisson process?
The rate of arrivals.
Tell me about it. What do you know? What is it?
1 over lambda.
1 over lambda? All right. All right. So,
and we know that the time between arrivals follows an exponential.
yes, very good. Excellent. You're already a step ahead of my conversation. I can go a lot faster now, I see. I can go a lot faster because this is going to go well. So Poisson process. So the Poisson distribution has a domain of 0 to infinity. That is, the values of x and the probability of x can be from 0 to infinity. And it describes the number of events or the number of truths or the number of draws from the pot that can come in a given time period, in a given sample, a given time period. So very often you can visualize the Poisson process like this, and they'll say, oh, well, it has some distribution that looks like this. And usually, as you tail out to the high number, it gets lower and lower and lower because the probability that there's a large count in a chunk of time is very small. Viewed from another point of view, you have this kind of boundary line, and you have a flow going across that boundary line. And you look at this boundary line over some chunk of time, my little clock right there, and you say, over this chunk of time, so many will cross this boundary. And the Poisson process, the probability is, what is the probability that this X number of things will cross that boundary? So for a queuing system, going back to our diagram here, for a queuing system, we could say this is a Poisson process over some chunk of time, an hour, a minute, whatever measure of time we're going to use. Over some chunk of time, we will receive this many arrivals to the queue. So that's our Poisson process. And yes, magic of magic, this process is of a nature that between the arrivals, if we have a time scale here, and the arrivals are kind of moving along in time here, they're traveling towards our destination, the time in between the arrivals is exponential. The time in between the arrivals is exponential. And I don't want to take the time to do it. In fact, I didn't even prepare notes for it because I knew I wasn't going to do it. But if I wanted to spend another 10 minutes, I could walk you through and show you that this is not a coincidence. This is, in fact, because the exponential and the Poisson distribution, in my opinion, are, in fact, the same distribution. They are, in fact, the same distribution. They are the same distribution viewed from a different perspective. The exponential and the Poisson distribution can be demonstrated to be identical to each other. You can do a little mathematical trick, and you can walk through a couple of steps and show how I start with a Poisson and end up with an exponential. And because it's the same pattern viewed from a different view. View the pattern as time between the arrivals, it's exponential. View the pattern as the count that occurs across a boundary at a certain chunk of time, and it's Poisson. And I can show you, if you want to take the time some other time, I can show you mathematically how they're identical. They are, in fact, mathematically the same thing. I won't get into it here, but when I'm teaching business school students who don't have real technical backgrounds, we would probably spend 15 or 20 minutes discussing this business about the exponential and the Poisson being the same thing, and we'd work a whole sheet of exercises converting from one to the other. It probably won't come up for us very often in railway stuff, but it's something to keep in mind, that you might get the data presented to you as time between arrivals, or you might get the data presented as a rate of flow. All of your queuing formulas on the sheet that I handed to you need the data as a rate of flow. So all of the queuing formulas you see on the sheet require that the arrivals and the service be expressed as a rate of flow. Otherwise, they don't work. And the most common mistake at undergraduate, non-technical students is they don't figure that out, and they put the wrong number in. They get the rate of flow and the time between arrivals backwards, and they put the wrong numbers in the formula. I don't think you're going to do that. I think you're more technical, more advanced than that. So we're not going to worry about that. So anyway, Poisson process, letter M. The next slot in here is the service process. At this very beginning entry level, with the formulas I've given you, you have two choices there. You have two choices. You have M again, so we could have a Poisson process for service. Or we could have D as a choice. What does D stand for? What does D stand for? Yes? Close. And depending on how you translate, maybe that's the right answer. I'm going to say deterministic. So discrete, deterministic as in it's fixed. It is non-changing. So deterministic, constant. So we have a Poisson process, a random distribution for the service time, or we have deterministic, a service that is completely perfect every time and never varies at all in time. And the reason this is included as one of the most basic entry-level queuing formulas that are taught is because there are a lot of situations in the real world where we could reasonably say the process is completely deterministic. Can you give me an example? Nava? Can you give me an example of a process where it's completely deterministic? There is no variation. Yes, John?
Maybe a ski lift?
Yeah. What kind of ski lift?
Well, the type that slows down the chairs for people to get in, but then they speed up. So even if there is a queue, it's quite set.
Yeah, so that's reasonably constant, although anyone here a big skier? A lot of skiers? Yeah, we got a few skiers. So it doesn't quite work out that way in practice though, right? It doesn't work, because otherwise, why does it keep stopping? You know, you're on the lift and then it stops. So that's not, the idea is there. A better example, I think, would be the roller coaster at Tivoli. Because it doesn't stop unless somebody's dead. I mean, the roller coaster at Tivoli doesn't stop, right, unless there's a horrible accident. It is really close to absolutely exact. Maybe not the one with the brakeman, not the old German, not the old antique roller coaster, because that one varies because there's a brakeman on that one, and the trip could change according to what the brakeman does. But the newer roller coasters that are all completely machine, electronic and machine controlled, the trip time on those is darn near constant. I mean, maybe it varies by a second or something for each trip. But those kind of roller coasters exact. Vending machines, a donut machine, an automatic donut making machine, any kind of machine process, any kind of automated machine process, easily deterministic. And you can see those, you look around, maybe the elevator is deterministic. Certainly the travel time between floors is fixed.
All the machine in the industry that's making the same process?
Sometimes, but there are other examples of machine processes that are not deterministic because somehow they have internal things. For example, the boot time on your laptop is not deterministic. Because you don't know, you boot up your machine and suddenly it decides to do a virus check. And now you've got a non-constant boot time. So there are machine processes that may not be deterministic because they have more than one state of being. They have more than one possible process, that kind of thing. Even a copy machine maybe isn't exactly deterministic because it might change according to how many colors of ink it's using, or whether it's double-sided or these kinds of things. So anyway, Poisson, deterministic, and then the last slot here is the number of servers. It's frequently referred to as the number of servers in a business course, because almost always the queuing conversation is about service. It's about customer service. We are obviously still interested in customer service, but for our specific technical conversation, we are looking at not queues of customers, but we are looking at queues of trains. So we are not talking about servers, but we are talking about resources. How many resources are there available to do the process, to do the service? And this is a number. It's the number of resources. How many resources are available simultaneously to handle the service, to do the process? There are another number of common measures in queuing that we're concerned with. And you can look at your formula sheet, and I've got a variety of formula combinations and variations for different measures of service. And I want to kind of go through the labels of those things. This probably will go pretty quick. You're a pretty sharp crowd. Let's see how this goes here. Start off with the letter L. You'll see some things on your formula sheet with the letter L. What does the letter L stand for? Sorry? Length. Length of what? Length of the queue, right? So this is a count. This is a count of items waiting in the queue. Now, I don't know if you will have this tricky bit here or not. Back home in the States, the most common student mistake is to confuse length with time. Because in our language, the way we use language back in the United States, it's very common to use the word length when referring to length of time. How long will it take? And then when my students are doing these kinds of equations in class, they see the letter L and they see it says length and they confuse it with time. And that's not what this is. This is not time. This is the count of items in the queue. Or the system, as we'll see here in a minute. So we have two subscripts to this letter L. We have two subscripts. We have L subscript Q. So this is the length average in the queue. And then we have L subscript S, which is the average length in the system. Length of the queue, length of the system. And the difference between these two is how many is in the system. So if your length of the system is 5 and your length of the queue is 3, then clearly there are 2 in the system at that point in time, or over that statistic. Similarly, we have W in our formulas. What is W? Time. W is time. And the English analogy is wait. Not E-I-G-H-T, but A-I-T. Wait. Wait time. And it follows the same labeling. So we have W in the queue for wait time in the queue, and WS for wait time in the system. So we have those 4 measures, 4 basic measures. How long are we waiting in the queue? How long are we taking to go through the whole system? How many items are in the queue? And how many items are in the whole system? Why do we care about these measures? Why do we care? Yeah, Ursa. Sorry? We have some limitations. Give me an example.
Like the number of the length of the queue,
Yes?
as we said before,
Yes?
or the number of people served. Yeah.
Yeah. So we just discussed that there might be a limit in the size of the queue. The size of the queue represents an inventory. If we were talking about a railway yard, we would want to estimate the capacity. We would estimate how much of that yard we're going to use, how many railway trains, how many coaches are going to be sitting in that yard waiting to be serviced. And so we want to use queuing formulas and/or simulation software to estimate how many things are going to be occupying that yard so we can verify whether that yard is going to function within its capacity or not. Ursa?
I didn't complete.
Sorry?
Can I continue?
Yes, please.
Nice. And then apart from limitations, what we do is that we can check our system, and then if we want to improve it, based on these inputs, we can see what can we do.
Yeah, so we can readjust these, we can do some experimental things. The nice, beautiful thing about analytical equations and/or numerical simulation software, as we'll see shortly, we can do a lot of experimental stuff to see how changes to the system influence the behavior of that system. So we're going to do all these calculations. We're interested in these guys here, and these guys here are going to be related again. How are they going to be related? How are these guys going? Ursa?
Depending on the queue, you're going to have also a waiting time. So if it's a really long queue, it means that you'll have to wait a lot.
Yeah?
Right?
Yeah? Yeah?
We can compare how long time does it take in processing or in waiting in the queues.
Yeah?
The efficiency of the servers.
Yeah? Yeah? And all of that together? This is coming back again, because you can look at queues and you can see Little's law in force, and you can look at the formulas on the page I handed out to you and tinker around with the math and suddenly see Little's law in some of the formulas. You can actually see it in the formulas on the page that I've handed out to you, that some of these values are related to each other by Little's law. So this is coming back again. So we have this coming back. Yeah, Naba.
Also, if the simulation, you need a parametric formula. And this is the parameters.
Now these formulas on your sheet, these formulas are exact.
Yeah.
That is, if you believe the restrictions that we've just decided, first come, first serve, infinite population, Poisson distribution on the arrival, if you believe all those things, or you can argue that they're true for your situation, then these formulas are exact. They're not parametric.
Okay.
They are God's truth.
Okay.
They're for real, if all those assumptions hold true. Now, we know in the real world, a lot of those assumptions don't hold true, and even if they do hold true for periods of time, they don't hold true continuously, right? Because we live in a real world where everything, even the big railroads in North America shut down on Christmas Day. You know, in the old days, you know, they kept running through Christmas Day, but today they don't. It's just not cost effective. It's just not worth it to keep the freight trains rolling on Christmas Day. So most railroads in North America, Christmas Day, they're closed. They just shut down. The passenger Amtrak runs, but they don't haul coal on Christmas Day. They don't move containers on Christmas Day. They don't. They just shut down. And on Thanksgiving and maybe Easter and July 4. They don't bother. It's cheaper for them to run more volume the day before and build up inventory and then shut down than it is for them to keep running through the holiday. So that's an example where suddenly we've just disrupted the whole logic of steady state performance, because now we have a cool down and a warm up, and we just ruined that. So right away you can see now we've already starting to see limits. These are nice estimates. These formulas are nice estimates for where we want to go. They're true within their definition, but in the real world the definition doesn't hold up, and so we have to go to simulation, which we'll see here shortly, to try to get a more accurate picture for the real world changing environment. So we have length, we have waiting time. There's a few other on your formula sheet. I don't want to get too detailed. There's some, for example, on your formula sheet there's utilization. There's the probability that the system is empty. It's a p subscript 0, or it's actually That's a P subscript 0, and on the typography, utilization is usually represented by the Greek letter rho, but the Greek letter rho and the letter P, English letter P, Roman letter P, look very similar, so sometimes we just get lazy and we use a P for both of them when we're typing on a keyboard that doesn't have too many Greek letters on it. And then you'll have a set of formulas only for the MM1. You have a set of formulas giving you a breakdown of the probability of a certain quantity of entities, to use a new vocabulary word, entities or customers in the system. Only for MM1. So again, already once we start launching off into alternate formations of queues, a lot of these formulas go away and suddenly we're stuck. We don't have anything. We don't have anything to do to give us the answer. So let's work a couple of practice examples. So we have on the next slide a practice here. Take a moment to try to work that.